Okay, welcome to Temple University Japan campus. We're extremely happy to have Nicholas Kralev, who will brief us on America's other army, and he's talking about the State Department. He's not talking about Blackwater. If you are new to our group, you can give us your business card, and we'll put you on our email list. And if you want to contribute to our programs, there's our ballot box, which is a kind of somewhat contrarian ballot box, because we don't take ballots, we take money. And there's a choice, obviously, between money and business cards. We'll take your cash. So we're extremely thankful to the Tokyo American Center for having made this possible. But we'd like to stress that this is not part of the Tokyo American Center, so whatever I say should not be construed as either as being part of the Tokyo American Center's message. So thanks again. So Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Do we need a microphone? Maybe I can. We'll have it, so we'll do this a little better. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming. I don't know how much you know about me. I saw there was a little thing outside with perhaps a couple of sentences, but I have never worked for the American government, so I don't speak for it. I'm a journalist, and I covered the State Department and the Secretary of State for 10 years until 2 years ago. And I've been working on the subject of the US Foreign Service since 2003. So just wanted to make it clear that I'm not here to defend or explain US policy on anything, just to tell you how American diplomacy works in 2012, how it's different from what it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago, and to make sense of it all. Why do American diplomats do what they do? And what is it that they do? So I came to this subject actually for, one of the reasons was personal. And that reason was that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, I was 15 and I was in Bulgaria. That's where I grew up. And until that point, I had wanted to be a theater director. But in '89, if you remember those pictures on TV, the theater was in the streets. Because for the first time in their lives, millions of people had the chance to express themselves freely after decades of communist rule. And so I decided to become a journalist because I wanted to tell these stories and understand them for myself and help other people understand them and make sense of them and try to figure out what the consequences will be on all our lives in Eastern and Central Europe. So at 19, I actually became a TV news reporter and at the same time was going to the university. And through my studies and my first contact with the American embassy in Bulgaria, I began learning about the role American diplomacy had played in ending the Cold War. I'm not saying American diplomacy ended the Cold War. I'm saying it played a role in ending the Cold War. So years later, I realized that nothing of what has happened to me would have happened had those events not taken place. I would have not gone to the US or gone to Harvard, become an American citizen, worked for the Financial Times and the Washington Times, traveled with the Secretary of State around the world, and certainly wouldn't have written this book. So I thought, well, look at this. American diplomacy had an impact on my life. Am I the exception? Does American diplomacy affect other people's lives? And how? How specifically and directly, how does that happen? So I went to the Kennedy School, and after that I went to work for the Financial Times, and in fact, even before I finished at the Kennedy School, I took my first trip with the Secretary of State, who at the time was Madeleine Albright. And then Colin Powell came in, and I continued traveling, and about the time the Iraq War began, I found myself sitting at the State Department every day, because the full-time resident press corps at the State Department have office space in the building. So I was there every day writing at least one story a day about some foreign policy issue or a country. I was traveling with the Secretary of State, but I realized I didn't know exactly what American diplomats did. Not these things that we've all seen. We've seen on TV the men in suits the handshakes, the negotiations, the nuclear agreements and all that, I remember very well. In fact, George Shultz negotiating with and signing agreements with Eduard Shevardnadze back when the Soviet Union was around. But so that was a perception I had. I thought I knew what diplomacy was. But in the 21st century, I wondered, is it what I thought it was? And I was visiting these American embassies and consulates with Colin Powell, but I realized that I was seeing a very small part of what the Foreign Service was doing. And I wanted to see what they did when we were not there with the Secretary of State. And when that country wasn't in a crisis because of an earthquake or another natural disaster. So I did an 8-part series in the Washington Times in 2003 of the same title, America's Other Army. And then that research expanded into this book. And my findings, actually some of them were quite surprising. For example, I didn't realize before this research how deeply the US is engaged in every single country in the world. As one person in the book says, American diplomacy is weaved into the fabric of people's lives. And we'll see in a few minutes how that happens. But unfortunately, as you have no doubt seen in the last month, it seems that only at a time of tragedy do the media and the public focus on diplomacy and the Foreign Service. And so you've seen the faces of these 4 Americans who died in Benghazi more than a month ago. And now people in the US are interested in the Foreign Service. And it was a very weird coincidence that my book came out literally a few days after the incident, and I couldn't have planned it, but that's what happened. So when I started my research from the very beginning, through all these trips that I did around the world several times, there were 3 main questions that I had in mind that guided me. And the first was the one on the screen. Why should we care about diplomacy? Seriously, does it affect our lives? Is it what I find many people think of diplomacy, and I call it this stratosphere of officialdom that takes place on some level out there that just doesn't seem to many people that really it affects real people, right? It's this government thing that is official, and but not very many people can relate to it. Especially in the US, when the military is so large that through families and friends, almost every American knows someone who's in the military, if not now, in the past. But that's not the case with the Foreign Service, of course. The second question was, what is diplomacy in the 21st century? And I'm sure to many of you this will be a very, very obvious question, but let me ask you, when you hear diplomacy, what do you think of? In one sentence, can you just give me a sense of what you think diplomacy does? Anyone? Yes?
Meeting people.
Meeting people, for what purpose?
For national interest.
Oh, how did we get from the meeting to the national interest? There's many dots between, but I mean, you're right, but you're jumping ahead. And it's not, I mean, if you say this to the average person, they would have no idea what you're talking about, right? How does meeting people, what does it have to do with the national interest? I mean, what I thought you would say was building relationships, right? Maintaining and building relationships. Okay, let's pretend that that's what he said. Relationships. All right. And what else? What does diplomacy do? What do diplomats do? Yes.
Preventing things from becoming much worse than they are.
Okay. So preventative function, preventing conflict is one of them. Yes.
I think
no. Oh, sorry.
I think you got it right, but backwards. It's meeting the national interest through people.
How does that? I mean, seriously, if
Because
you
the only way you can solve problems is at a person-to-person level through diplomacy. It all comes down to people.
well, that's not how the Bush administration tried to solve the problem in Iraq.
That's exactly why they got it. That's exactly why they got it wrong.
Right. Okay. What about what else? Yes.
Improving foreign relationships.
Sorry.
Improving foreign relationships.
Improving relationships. Okay. Yes.
Promoting trade.
Trade. Right. Very important. But why why improving? Does that, diplomats often accused of trying to be too nice to other countries. Why improving? How about just having relationships? Because you can't have the great relationship with every country, right? Right now in North Korea and Iran, the US doesn't have a good relationship. Okay. So the question is, should diplomacy strive to improve relationships just for the sake of having good relationships, or should it be doing it in the name of national interest? But anyway, okay. We'll come back to that. My third question was, what do American diplomats do every day, specifically? Not just meeting people. To me, that's nonsense. I mean, so what? Specifically, why do they do it? How do they do it? How effective are they? And this was the most difficult question to get answers to. Because I don't know about other foreign services, but the American Foreign Service is not good at being specific. It was like pulling teeth. It took so much effort to get the people that I interviewed to actually specifically tell me what their profession was. I was getting answers like, we advance a positive agenda. I said, what? That's your profession? A lot of people say, well, it depends. Well, no, what depends on what? I mean, I know it's complicated, but come on. You go to a domestic audience in the US, they know what teachers do, they know what doctors do. Tell me in one sentence, what do American diplomats do? Well, it was difficult. Okay, but with these questions in mind, I went around and visited 52 American embassies and consulates, interviewed about 600 career diplomats, and the last 7 secretaries of state. The 4 I covered, I traveled with Albright, Powell, Rice, and Hillary Clinton, and the previous 3, which I was too young to cover, with George Shultz, Jim Baker, and Warren Christopher. So let me introduce you to just 4 of these 600 to give you a sense of some of the things they've done in their careers, just to show you whether diplomacy is what we think it is and whether it is what typically has been happening in the last few decades. So the first of these 4 is a guy called Cameron Monta, who was the American ambassador to Pakistan in the last 2 years. He was one of the few people, you probably remember the picture of Hillary Clinton with her hand on her mouth watching the bin Laden raid in Pakistan, the raid that killed bin Laden in May of 2011. He was one of the few people who watched that raid. He was in Islamabad because in addition to the feeds that were in Washington, there were also feeds in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And of course it fell upon Monta and his team at the embassy to explain to the Pakistani government why it had no idea that a foreign military operation was taking place on its territory, which was not the hard part. What was much more difficult was then to repair the relationship, which still hasn't happened. Because the context of the bin Laden raid was just so terrible for any relationship, let alone the one with Pakistan. The raid happened 4 months after an undercover CIA contractor killed 2 Pakistanis, and 5 months before a NATO airstrike inadvertently killed 24 Pakistani soldiers. So these 3 major blows to the relationship in 2011, and you are the American ambassador. Go, right? And in fact, there is a very interesting story in the book about, which was, in fact, if some of you have seen the excerpt in Foreign Policy magazine, that I think that story was there too. But after the bin Laden raid, the Obama administration felt that it now had more leeway to get the Pakistanis to do certain things that they wouldn't do before. And so they sent the ambassador with a list of 25 things to get the Pakistanis to do, and he went to the chief of staff of the army, General Kayani, the most powerful person in the Pakistani military and one of the most powerful people in the country. And General Kayani threw the ambassador out of his office. And Monta said, I've rarely been insulted as a diplomat, but he's a nice man, but he just threw me out. He said, is this how you treat people who are down? Because the Pakistan government was dealing with all the domestic pressures and all this criticism that it had allowed the Americans to go in and do this thing with bin Laden. But anyway, before Pakistan, Monta was the ambassador to Serbia. And another interesting story, in Serbia in 2008, a few days after the US recognized Kosovo as an independent state, a few hundred Serbs attacked the American embassy and set part of it on fire. And a few days later, the ambassador got evidence that the person who had approved the attack was none other than the Prime Minister of Serbia. And so the ambassador decided that he would do everything in his power to make sure that the Prime Minister lost the next election, which was 5 months away.
Right.
And that's what he did. He didn't even tell Washington he was doing it. Condi Rice had no idea. He did it, no, the CIA was not involved.
Okay.
But I'm sure some of you might think this is interference in another country's domestic affairs. The ambassador thought that any leader of any country that approves an attack on any embassy had no business being in power. So for him, that was enough to do this. So see, he engineered this very sophisticated behind-the-scenes thing that involved the Spanish Prime Minister, and because he decided the best way to get this guy out of power was to make sure that one of his coalition partners withdrew his support from him, and that's what happened. But before Serbia, Monta was the leader of what was called a PRT, a Provincial Reconstruction Team, in Iraq. There were over 30 of those. And he was up in the north, in Mosul, and he and his team basically taught the Iraqis in that province how to govern themselves. This was doing things like setting up a judicial system, building infrastructure, paving roads, building schools and hospitals, none of which this guy knew how to do. He had to educate himself within days how to do it, and then, because he didn't get much training from the State Department, but that's what these people did. You went out, and there's still PRTs in Afghanistan. In Iraq, there aren't because the military is now gone, but they were embedded. These were civilian military units that would normally be based, live and sometimes work out of a base, of a military base in Iraq. And this was, he said, until that point, my career was spent, well, actually, he said that he came in 85. So until Iraq, where he was in 2006, for the first time, he said he had never been more than 1 hour away from Berlin by plane in his career. And so that was clearly very different. He wasn't wearing suits, he was wearing boots every day. And he also said that from the army base to the provincial council building where they went every day, they were attacked every day. Whether it was rocket fire or roadside bombs, they were attacked every single day. The second of the four is Yuri Kim, who is a Korean American, and she's currently the political counselor at the embassy in Ankara in Turkey. And you can imagine she has spent a lot of time in the past year working on the Syria issue, because you probably know that thousands of Syrians have crossed over to Turkey and are currently in refugee camps. And at the time Cameron Monta was dealing with the embassy on fire in Belgrade, she was in North Korea. Why? There are no American diplomats in North Korea, right? There are no diplomatic relations between the US and North Korea. Well, she was there accompanying the New York Philharmonic, which had a concert tour in Pyongyang in 2008. She actually negotiated the visit, which was a carrot. We have, in diplomacy, we have carrots and sticks, right? So the concert tour was a carrot for the North Koreans to do certain things that the US wanted them to do in the nuclear negotiations. Okay, the third of the four is David Lynwall, who just came back from Baghdad, where he was the political military counselor. And his main job, as is the main job of any political military section at any American embassy, was selling American weapons to the Iraqi government. And he told me that since the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, the Iraqi government has purchased over $16 billion worth of American weapons. Before Baghdad, Lynwall was the deputy chief of mission in Haiti, where he managed to search for missing Americans after the 2010 earthquake. His house actually collapsed, and he's alive today only because he wasn't home. But another member of the embassy, the cultural affairs officer, Victoria DeLong, died because she was home when her house collapsed. And before that, David was the deputy chief of mission in Guatemala. One of the main things he and the embassy did during that time was to reform the Guatemalan child adoption system. Did you know that American diplomats reform child adoption systems? So why do they care? Guatemala is not that big of a country. It's not right next, it's close to the US, but it's not like it's Mexico. Why do they care? Well, turns out many Americans adopt children from Guatemala. In fact, Guatemala is number 3 after only China and Russia among the countries from where Americans adopt children. And that system was so corrupt that American parents were wasting thousands and thousands of dollars on bribes. And you may have an idea what the average American does when they're frustrated with the government. They call their members of Congress, right? Or they write their members of Congress, and of course then the Congress puts pressure on the State Department, and so that's why the American embassy had to do this. And that actually was not even as serious or a massive an effort as the one that the embassy in Chile did at the same time. And that was to reform the Chilean judicial system. This was in the 90s, a few years after Augusto Pinochet was gone from power. And until then, the Chileans didn't have trials. Can you imagine? I was very surprised. I had no idea that they didn't have trials. One judge decided everything. They had trials on appeal, but not until then. So the embassy decided to pour millions of dollars and many, many human hours to help the Chileans. The Chileans actually wanted the help. It's difficult to impose help when the country doesn't want it. But I thought one of the interesting things was not that the embassy brought down from the US American architects, in addition to the lawyers and other legal experts, but architects to teach the Chileans how to build courthouses. Because they didn't have courthouses, they didn't have trials, they didn't need courthouses until then. But as rarely happens these days, the Chilean media declared the effort a success and gave credit to the United States. Big thing. There's not many, the media not in many countries is willing to do that. And as I said, the country has to be willing to receive the help, and which is not always the case. And in fact, in the book I quote someone who is at the embassy here, Byron, who is one of the assistant information officers at the embassy, who was in Nicaragua before he came here. And he told me the story. In 2007, the American embassy realized that the police in Nicaragua didn't have a database, a computer database, which is a problem because if you did, then it will help you with solving crimes, right? So the embassy went and said, we can build one, or we can help you build a database, and you don't even have to pay for it. We'll do it because we have funds that. And so the Nicaraguans basically, well, almost. Well, they kind of did spit in his face and said, no, your policies did this and this to our country, go away, we don't need any help. So he said, well, okay, I'll just tell Washington to give the funds to another country. And then the Nicaraguans said, oh, wait a second, wait, we can do something. So they did, but it just comes to show that imposing anything, many people have talked in the last several years about imposing democracy. It's difficult to impose anything when the country doesn't like it. Whether you do it through diplomacy or military means, it's another story. But okay, and the last of the 4 is Gavin Stonewall, who I actually met in Beijing in 2003, where he was the head of the American Citizen Services section. And that every consulate has this American Citizen Services section, which helps Americans, whether it's just issue you a temporary passport, or register the birth of a child, or a death, or help a tourist who's been marked. But he obviously issuing passports and visas, that you know that, I don't have to tell you that. But one of the first things he did in the Foreign Service in '98 was, he was in Panama, his first tour, and so he found himself sitting in a jail he says a cross from two satanist killers, one with menacingly piercing blue eyes. But so he was sent there because as a consular officer, he was supposed to go and make sure that these criminals who were American citizens were treated humanely and according to the Vienna Conventions, which govern consular affairs around the world. And Gavin just came back from Afghanistan, where he was the press attaché, he was the information officer at the embassy. And you may remember that a few months ago, an American soldier went and killed 16 Afghans, women and children. And a few months before that, some American soldiers were burning the Quran and were very happy to be photographed. So this guy was one of the people who had to put out those public relations fires. Because I mean, how do you explain these actions? Especially when you have so many American soldiers on the ground at danger literally every day. But he had to do it. So just to review quickly, and by the way, this is a good country to do this, and I didn't mention because I assume you know it, but every American embassy and consulate every day of the year promotes American business, right? So whether it's expanding existing markets for American companies, opening up new markets, or something that actually has been happening here, trying to lower or eliminate certain import duties or other things. But that's what American embassies do in addition to everything else. So when I looked at just this very short list of duties that these 4 people have done in their career, and of course that's a very small part of what they've done. Cameron Monta has been in since 1985. He actually just retired, but that's just a very, very short list. And I looked at this and said to myself, how could this be? How can teaching effective governance, nuclear negotiations, cultural events, reforming child adoption systems and judicial systems, selling American weapons, recovering from natural disasters, promoting American business, issuing passports and visas, visiting prisoners in jail, and fixing public relations problems, how can this be part of the same profession? Do you know of any other profession that has all this in there? I mean, I'm not saying that there are experts in the Foreign Service who do. Now, Anne is a public diplomacy officer, right? So chances are, as a public diplomacy officer, she probably in her career she has and will choose jobs that are in that field. But it's one thing to be a cultural affairs officer in Tokyo, and a completely different thing to be the press attaché in Kabul. Plus, Anne, because of the reasons that not necessarily have to do with career, but perhaps with way of life or her family, she might want to go to a country that would require her to do a job that's perhaps an economic job or a political job. And in fact, to get promoted, you do have to be diverse. So the point is, American diplomats are expected to be able to do all this. And the average Foreign Service officer will probably do about a third of this in their career, 20 or 30-year career. Jack of all trades, right? Well, that's what they're expected to do. The diversity now is very much priced in the Foreign Service. And if you want to get promoted into the senior Foreign Service, you are expected to have served in different geographic regions now. Now, it used to be, they had the Arabists and they had the Asia expert, they had Latin America as well. No, they're now saying, no, we don't want that as much as you used to. You need to have a wider range of experiences. So how does this make sense? Why are we doing these things? I went to a document called the National Security Strategy, which every president publishes. And in this White House, the Obama White House, this is what it expects of the Foreign Service. To help prevent conflict, spur economic growth, strengthen weak and failing states, lift people out of poverty, combat climate change and epidemic disease, and strengthen institutions of democratic governance. Oh my God, how much money do you need to do that? Well, is this about changing the world? How many people do you, how much time do you need to do this? And why lift people out of poverty? I mean, is there a limit to that? Where, it doesn't say in these countries or in that region, it's blanketed everywhere, right? So how does that make sense? Why do we need to do all that? And, as was already mentioned, everything you do in foreign policy should be linked to the national interest, right? I mean, that's why you do things in foreign policy, not in diplomacy. People often say, well, what does the diplomatic mean? What's diplomatic? Well, people say it means polite, right? Nice, polite, tactful. Well, maybe not only that. But I wanted to go to the US national interest and try to find that direct link between all these duties and the national interest. The good news is that since 9/11, there has been agreement in the Republican and Democratic parties on the national interest. And so this is, according to the current national security strategy, this is the national interest. Three main elements of it: the security of the United States, the prosperity of the country, and the values it stands for. And to make the story short, the American government has decided in the last 2 administrations that the only way for the US to be truly secure is for the entire world to be secure and stable. That's it. It's not the name. It's not the Western Hemisphere. It's not. It's the whole world. Because, and actually, both Condi Rice and Hillary Clinton explain in the book extensively why that is. But as Clinton said, 9/11 proved conclusively that the 2 oceans on either side of the country don't protect us anymore. And so, an internal conflict in any country, look at Syria, can easily spill over into the neighboring countries and affect the region and possibly the whole continent. And that can affect American interests, whether it's political interests or economic interests. In fact, why did the American embassy in Chile have to help them reform the judicial system? Well, it turned out that there are many American companies in Chile who were suffering from the previous system because it was so unpredictable, because it was one judge who decided everything. And so the American companies were directly affected by that. The same logic goes to prosperity. They've decided that for the US to be truly prosperous, okay, for the entire world won't be prosperous in the next few thousand years, but at least the point is to have as many countries as possible with functioning economies that produce economic growth. And you can imagine that in the last few years it's been difficult for American diplomats to preach this because of what's in their own backyard and the economic situation in the US and unemployment, but they've still been doing it. So how does this go back to the mission of the Foreign Service? So this world that is supposed to be more secure and prosperous, that doesn't exist yet, that's what they say is the world we seek. And that's what they've tasked the American Foreign Service with, at least partially, to bring that world about. So transforming, and Condi Rice used to call that transformational diplomacy, as some of you may remember. At the same time, though, the White House says, well, there's also the world we live in, and the world as it is, and we have to deal with it, which is in fact what classic diplomacy does, right? Libya happens, you have to deal with it. Syria happens, you have to deal with it. And so this is now the dual mission of the American Foreign Service, to deal with the world as it is and help to bring about a more secure and prosperous world so the United States can be more secure and prosperous. That's the justification of this very, very diverse list of duties, which was in fact a very short list to begin with. And as I'm not going into details on traditional diplomacy because I'm sure you know that, but these just the 4 core functions of traditional diplomacy.
Let's start with Q&A pretty soon.
Yeah. Okay, can I finish my presentation, please? I mean, I see people interested, they're taking notes, so I'm sorry, but thank you. So we talked about managing foreign relations, representing the US and its people. This goes for any country, not just the US. And then assisting American citizens, which I mentioned. And then the last one, of course, is the multilateral diplomacy, as we call it, which is managed by the UN, the EU, APEC, ASEAN, and these multilateral organizations. And transformational diplomacy is all about good governance. Condi Rice says, well, it was never about imposing democracy. It was not about transforming other countries in the US image. It was about good governance. And what does that mean? Having a responsible and accountable government that respects the rights of its people and provides basic services and economic opportunity. Because the argument is, if you have a government that doesn't provide basic services and economic opportunities, look at, for example, the Muslim world. Over half of the population is under 40 years old. A big part of that is under 25. So if those opportunities don't exist and people don't have jobs, then they would turn to other means to feed their families. And that's how they may have to go and engage in criminal activity, possibly even terrorism. They can join a terrorist group that then consequently can attack US interests or the US, the country. And so that's now the big thing in the American Foreign Service. And it's not, you don't see it necessarily in Japan, because the US has no intention of transforming Japan, because it's a democracy and it's a it's a working democracy and it's a functioning democracy and a functioning economy. But I thought I would talk about this because it's not something that comes up often here, and that's not what the American Embassy in Tokyo does. But because the world is so diverse and there's so many different countries, as I said, even in the same career track in the Foreign Service, like public diplomacy or economic or political, it's so different from country to country of what you do, and this obviously brings the question of who is a good diplomat, or what makes a good diplomat, and what skills are needed in the Foreign Service. So because of that diverse list, then the skills needed are so diverse. And we can, if you're interested in the Q&A, we can talk about joining the Foreign Service. Yeah, right.
30 minutes, and our public is used to a very interactive discussion, so.
Yes, and they shall have it.
Yeah. No, but we just have a few minutes.
But in terms of the coming into the Foreign Service and the skills that are needed, and all these, the written test and the oral test are all supposed to bring in people, a very diverse pool of people, because you never know where you'll be thrown and required to do things. And as so many people said in the book, it's in the Foreign Service today, it's like being thrown in a pool and learning how to swim. Because training is not exactly the strong suit of the Foreign Service. Diplomacy, for decades they've been saying you can't learn diplomacy in the classroom, you have to learn it on the job. And Colin Powell didn't agree with that quite, he said, no, you need to have professional development. You have to create this path for people, because a career can be so unpredictable, but at the same time, you do need to have good people in the right places and the right time. In any case, before we get to Q&A, just wanted to mention one of the techniques that I used in the book. We talked about, but the direct link between what diplomats do and the national interest. And because I didn't want to write an academic book, but a practical book that people could relate to, and so my other technique was to humanize the diplomacy, humanize the Foreign Service, and put human faces and human stories next to each of that. And so for everything that I write about in the book, I have at least one real life story, an example, just to illustrate how it is that this is being done. And I jumped and galloped because any of these subjects and any other subjects that you're interested in, I'm happy to answer questions about. So,
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just, I'll start with the first question. One thing that differentiates the US from other developed countries is that many ambassadorships are for sale. I mean, it's different. It's kind of how does this affect the morale of this Foreign Service? I mean, in other words, for example, if you take Japan, if you're a British diplomat, a German diplomat,
and you're interested in Japan, you can hope one day to become the ambassador to Japan. Here, the probability is extremely low. It's going to be someone who either was a friend of the president, a Speaker of the House who lost an election and something had to be done with them, a former Vice President of the United States, a campaign contributor, and one who was admittedly a great academic, Reichauer. And I think in between there was one who was a Foreign Service officer. So how does this affect the morale of the staff?
In the American system, about a third of ambassadorships are political, which is very unusual. Typically, it's between 1 and 2 in the countries that have that. I found that the Foreign Service didn't really have a problem with that these people exist, because some of them are very good, and sometimes you need blood from outside to come and give you some perspective, an outside perspective. What most people told me was that the problem they have is with the way these people are selected. In other words, they're not selected based on their skills and experience. They're selected on how much contribution they made, not necessarily by giving money to the candidate or the president when he was a candidate, but helping with the fundraising effort. So you'll see not necessarily people who gave him $10 million. You'll see people who headed up the campaign in California, or the ambassador to Paris currently was the finance co-chair for the Obama campaign in California in 2008. So these are the people who are getting it, and if we have good political ambassadors, it's honestly out of luck, because that's not how they're selected, and it's unfortunate, and that's why one of the things I discuss in the book is the fact that so many people think that anyone can do diplomacy. And I wanted to write this book because diplomacy is a profession. It's not a hobby. Yes, Angelina Jolie is an ambassador for UNHCR, and she's doing a good job. No, she's bringing, none of these issues would be in the media if it wasn't for her. But that's not the point. The point is that she's not a trained diplomat. She's not a diplomat. She may be a goodwill ambassador, that's great. And that's, using, I think that the word ambassador has been overused. They give it to so many people now to mean various things. But there's no question that none of us will probably trust someone who wasn't trained as a doctor to perform surgery on us, right? Or you wouldn't trust someone who wasn't trained to build bridges to build a bridge or a building. But for some reason, people think everyone can do diplomacy, and that's a perfect example of illustration of how people who never knew anything, who had any background in anything that has to do with diplomacy, become ambassadors.
Thank you. Yeah, in the back. Even though we don't encourage backbenching.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ethan Green. First question for the audience. I was curious if people here worked at the American Embassy or worked in the Foreign Service, and they could raise their hand. Just curious. 2 people. Okay. So maybe you could agree with what the gentleman said, or not.
Or not.
Yeah. So my question is about the screening process and the test. And I took the Foreign Service test in February last year, and maybe just frankly speaking, I thought a lot of the questions were kind of ridiculous. And I didn't make it to the next round, so I wouldn't really know what else would happen. But I'm kind of curious what you think about the screening process and how they are choosing, new people for the State Department. Thank you.
The reason it's really difficult to design a process, an effective process, is because they want people to be jacks of all trades. It's because it's so different. How do you select how do you test for something that you don't even know what you're testing for? I mean, how do you know what exactly this person will do in the Foreign Service, right? So they've designed the process that they say they're very proud of, the recruitment office that deals with these things and designs the written test and then the oral examination. They hired industrial psychologists just to design this process to get the best people. Now, how do you know that you missed out on great people? How do you know that someone who you rejected would have been a good diplomat? You don't. You can see the people who came in, that some of them may not turn out to be good diplomats, but that's There's nothing you can do at the time of the process. So that's why they've designed this test. The test basically tests basic intellectual and or basic intellect and knowledge, right? Current affairs, geography, and all these other things. And whatever you think of it, it won't change anytime soon. So that's the bottom line. The orals, because of the nature of the oral examination, very subjective. It really depends on the people who are talking to you and who are asking you those questions. And so I think they've tried to put a focus on training those people, the people who are examining you, to be better trained and understand exactly. But the other thing is, I'm talking subjective. Who's a good foreign service officer? And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was in Sudan, and the charge there, because there's no ambassador, but the charge told me that his political counselor was the best political officer he'd ever seen in his life. This woman there was the best political officer. 2 weeks later, I was in Beijing, and the deputy chief of mission in Beijing, it turned out, knew the woman in Sudan. He told me she was the worst political officer he ever saw. So, what if these two people, the charge in Sudan and the DCM in Beijing, were on the same oral examination panel? Who would they let through? It's very difficult, very, very difficult. Yes. I'm sorry.
Just my experience real quick. I took the exam in '88, and it was a very different exam. Well, first you need to know, there really wasn't a process until after World War II. If you weren't white, male, Ivy League, you could not get into the Foreign Service. And so they kind of democratized it after World War II, created the Foreign Service exam, and it was a very kind of objective exam. You had to know a little about a lot. But then the State Department got sued by minorities and women. And they had to change the Foreign Service exam. So the exam that you took is very different. And now it's full of all of these. I've read them both, and you're right. I mean, they ask these questions that have nothing to do with diplomacy. And the real reason is so they can increase the pool of women and minorities and get the right numbers into the Foreign Service. And it's the Foreign Service's little dirty secret. Yeah.
Well, they're saying that they want the Foreign Service to look more like America.
Which is a great thing, but it makes the exam really bad.
Right. So, but still, if you look at the statistics, 80% is still white in the Foreign Service. The difference is 40% of women now. So that's clearly very different. Black Americans only 5%, Asians 7%. Yes.
Thank you very great presentation. My name is Dr. Manager Duka. I have many questions, but I say 3 questions.
Well, let's get other people.
Okay. Okay. One question is does your speech or lecture include some secret matters or confidential matters, secret missions or confidential matters? And how do you get that information? And the second question is,
we take 3 questions.
Okay.
Short.
Okay. That's different.
No need to answer all of them.
Okay. Do by himself or herself, or supported by other people. Or the second question. Or the third question is U.S. implemented deep regulation or economics. So now companies or other institutes maybe and diplomacy relationship is very important. I think. What do you think?
I don't think I understood the second question, but
You can repeat the second question.
Okay. Take an example. Japanese diplomats, the Japanese politicians do not decide by themselves. Usually, bureaucrats decide because they don't. Anyway, diplomats is not an expert. Diplomats are not expert in many fields, so they don't have so much information. That's why without the support or advice, how do they implement those matters?
How much does the political leadership rely on what diplomats tell them, or who's really making the decisions?
And civil service support of the diplomat.
Well, diplomacy is not intelligence gathering, although diplomats clearly gather information, they just don't hide it. right? When they talk to government officials, even journalists, they gather information. You might have read WikiLeaks, right? These were cables written based on meetings and conversations American diplomats have had.
Usually it's not transparent.
What's not transparent?
For example, when I say Okinawa was returned to Japan, Japanese government, hide some secret, confidential matters, which is Japan has got paid money, and Okinawa was returned to Japan.
That's a question of the archives.
Right.
That is,
but
the side letters were classified, and they were declassified in the U.S. before they were declassified in Japan, which is often the case. So that's a somewhat different issue.
Okay, right. Yeah. But, well, there's no question that diplomacy needs sometimes this space, whether you call it secrecy, whatever you call it, to be effective. Which is why, this reaction to the WikiLeaks cables. But in a way, the WikiLeaks cables was sort of silver lining, because many Americans actually learned a few things about the Foreign Service. And I talk about this in the book, but the three main things that apparently surprised a lot of Americans. Well, the first one was that American diplomats can write. That was apparently a surprise. The second was that what they wrote was actually interesting. Well, some of what they wrote was interesting. And the third was that, turns out, for the most part, what they said in private was pretty much what they said in public. Not in every case, but that was the overall impression. I don't know whether anybody read 250,000 of those cables, but probably the State Department did. And then the other thing with the foreign, I'm often about this. The American Foreign Service doesn't make foreign policy, right? The political leaders of the country make the policy, and the Foreign Service implements the policy.
Okay.
So I'm asked, for example, what is the Foreign Service doing about Syria? Well, it's not the Foreign Service's foreign policy. It's very difficult to freelance in the Foreign Service. And if people say, what if you don't agree? Well, there are ways to deal with not agreeing with the policy. You can, well, the good news is that every couple of years you change jobs. Here it's 3 years. In Sudan it's every 2 years. In Iraq and Afghanistan it's every year. You change jobs. So if you have a problem with it, just wait it out, and either you'll be gone or your boss will be gone, right? But if you so strongly disagree, then you can ask to be transferred, or you can leave the Foreign Service. And we had 3 people left the Foreign Service over the Iraq War. 5 left over Bosnia in the 90s, which is surprising. I thought that there would have been more over Iraq, but they weren't.
If I can follow up on...
You mentioned Iraq and Kabul, Baghdad and Kabul are 1-year tours. And I believe in the tour there's like 2 home leaves. You don't
60 vacation days.
60, not at the same time. So
right,
it's like,
right.
So these are countries that are very different from the United States. If you're an American, you land in Vancouver, you can kind of understand the place pretty quickly. Most Americans land in Baghdad and Kabul. It takes a little time to adjust. It's somewhat different from most of the United States. How does one run an embassy where your personnel rotates every year and doesn't even stay a full year? And when you talk to FSOs, did they raise this question? Because I've worked in the private sector. If every year your people rotate, it's kind of a joke. So how does one deal with this?
Well, they agree with that. The problem is that but what's the alternative to make them stay there longer, right? Nobody wants to stay in Kabul for more than a year, right?
Well, Americans were fighting in World War II, stayed there until it was over.
The diplomats?
No, the guys who were fighting the Axis.
Right, but that's the difference. When you join the Foreign Service of any country, you don't expect to be in a war zone, right? You expect to do diplomacy, whatever you think that means. And so now we have this redefinition, or a new definition of diplomacy that means, no, you'll be in a war zone, something that the military calls it non-permissive environment. But there's no question that you need a few months to get used to it, right? And then you also need a couple of months to, because you're thinking about your next assignment, and you have to move again, and depending on where your family is, because your family is not allowed to come with you to Iraq or Afghanistan, so that's another. There's no question, but they've decided that's how they'll do it, because here's the thing, if you say, people ask me, people say, well, 3 years is too little. Why do they move every 3 years, which is the most now that you can be in the Foreign Service? Well, unless when you do Japanese language, you spend 2 years learning the Japanese, and 1 in Washington and 1 here, and so. But anyway, 3 years is too little. Well, if you allow people to stay more than 3 years in Tokyo, then what about the people who are in Africa and in Iraq and Afghanistan? How long are they going to stay there? So that's why they've decided this many posts will have 1 year, then this many will Africa. Much of Africa is 2 years. It's not only difficult. There's no question that the effectiveness of an embassy, I think I saw it, exists. It's there, but there's no talk of any kind of extending the 1 year. That's how it is, and they rely, I suppose, on the people, on the local employees, the Iraqis who work at the American embassy in Baghdad, or the third country nationals who've been there longer, and some contractors. I mean, there's still many contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan that, if they want, they can stay 2 years.
Okay, you have a mic, and then next person. So, yeah.
Mr. Kralev, thank you for this eye-opening presentation. I just have a very simple question. Have you ever met a diplomat that told you, who told you I was 100% prepared for the job before I joined the service?
No.
Thank you.
They didn't know what to. I mean, they thought they knew what to expect, and they came in, and it turns out it's not quite. Well, that's why I typically say the only people who know what exactly goes on in an embassy are the people who work in an embassy. It's just very difficult to know on a day-to-day basis what exactly happens, how they do it. Do they hold meetings? Well, why do they hold meetings? What happens at these meetings? Are they just doing them because it's on the schedule? And that's the dots for me, the connectivity, the link between, the final thing. What I had to, for myself at least, work out, because one of the things that happened when I first started doing this research in 2003, I would ask people, so what do you do, and then how does what you do fit into the big picture of American foreign policy? And many people weren't able to tell me how that fit into the big picture. They had enough to do. They sometimes were overworked, but when you asked them about this whole thing, they couldn't. They just hadn't worked it out in their heads. Yeah.
I think you have the mic. Yeah, and then we'll go to the front. Okay.
Okay, yes. This is more on the A part than on the Q part. Sorry about that. I'm a German diplomat, and I wanted to add just a remark on the question of 1 year or 2 years of travel and about that question. In our system, we have to sign a letter of commitment that we go wherever we are being sent, period. Now, this is pure theory. It never works. It's always a question of negotiating. Most diplomats are interested in their career, so they get an offer that is very hard to decline. So they go to the place that they might not have preferred to go to. They might land in Kabul. That's one way to send people. The other one is, and we have an astonishing percentage of such people, simply guys and girls who like those places, who really enjoy being in remote, bushy areas where they can roll up the sleeves and get a lot of things done very, very easily. And as a matter of fact, and in that respect, I would even try to challenge your thesis. That's the places where you even can do the policy, the foreign policy on your own. It's certainly not in France or in Moscow. You're absolutely right there. The big issues are being dealt with by the politicians. But in the not so important countries, there's still a lot of influence that the normal rank and file career diplomat has.
In the U.S. Foreign Service, you signed the same thing.
Yeah, so there's this term of...
Just a second, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I remember talking to a Foreign Service officer who was
ambassador in Tajikistan. Now, that's not a political appointment, because even if you give billions of dollars to a political action committee, you don't come to the president and say, I want to be ambassador in Tajikistan. In fact, you probably don't have to give billions to be able to buy it. And he actually happened to be there when the US went into Afghanistan, and he was heavily involved in dealing with the base issues and lots of things which he knew a lot about, because and no one, of course, in Washington even knew what Tajikistan was, so he had a lot more autonomy than if he had been in Tokyo under the daily supervision of Washington.
What was the question?
Yeah, I said it was an 8.
The worldwide availability is, of course, a requirement in the American Foreign Service. The impact you might have, yes, if the country is not on the president's radar screen every day, you have more leeway, you have more impact. But doesn't, used to be, for example, Afghanistan or Pakistan 10 years ago would not have been, or 13 years ago wouldn't have been on the president's radar screen every day, but they are today. And so, but at the same time, just as you said about your foreign service, I know people in the American Foreign Service who would rather die than serve in Paris.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They just don't think Paris is worth it because it's not challenging.
One more similarity.
Right. And so, but this worldwide availability you say doesn't work in practice. Well, you bid on jobs in the U.S. Foreign Service, right? And there are 275 American diplomatic missions around the world. How many German missions are there, right?
200.
Okay, well, I think it was like 160 something. But anyway, but the point is, most German diplomats, if they go do an overseas tour, then they go back to Berlin, right? Almost of every tour. It's very rare that you'll see someone who moved around without going to Berlin for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
But because there's so many posts and positions in the American Foreign Service, I know people who made the Syrian Foreign Service without a single tour in Washington. I mean, it's not very common, but it happens. And so when you bid, as I said earlier, you bid most of the time based on career considerations, because you want to get promoted, but sometimes you may bid because your wife is sick of living in Africa and wants to go to live in Singapore for a couple of years. Or maybe your children's education is more important now than it was 3 or 5 years ago because they've grown up.
Yes, and then Sam. And then
I'm wondering if I could change the tone of the conversation. As an American, I believe that most of us are very proud of the people who work in the foreign service. Because America is a very parochial country. And really, most Americans don't know what really is going on in the rest of the world. And if the foreign service people go out into the world and they come back and they're able to enlighten the ordinary Americans about what's going on in the rest of the world, as well as journalists, it's a great service that they're doing for American people. And I thank you for talking about this. I'm very appreciative to you. And I wonder if anybody would like to comment, yourself or anybody in the audience, perhaps our esteemed journalist here. The role of the American ambassador, I believe, in Japan is actually to be a linkage between the Japanese government and the American government. And that American ambassador can only do that if they have come from a political environment. I do believe, maybe somebody can tell me different, but that it's a second person in the embassy or the third person in the embassy who really has the power and does the running of the embassy. Those people usually do speak Japanese, the minister counselor, and I believe that those people are the real ones in power in the embassy, and that the American ambassador is just sent here for several years, and I'm sure the Japanese government is very happy to have these people. Like, I'm sure they're very happy to have them because they have a direct link to the president.
Well, I don't know if the DCM has more power than the ambassador. You probably end up with people who are having more responsibilities than power. But it's true. Typically, a political ambassador would not speak the language. That's an exception if they did. But the people under him, they do speak the language, and some of them very, very well, in fact. But on the Foreign Service educating Americans, that's not what the Foreign Service is supposed to do. The Foreign Service, it's not its job to educate Americans. At least they don't think it's their job to educate Americans. So during the Cold War, this was actually banned because it would have been considered propaganda. But I do believe that they could, and maybe it's not the Foreign Service, maybe it's the Secretary of State who should educate Americans. But that's because I'm trying. I wrote a book, but I know one person couldn't do it. Yeah.
I'm Sam James. I'm a journalist who's been here 52 years because I was drafted into the Army. And I have a very simple question. I've heard somewhere that the cost of the bands, or military bands that the U.S. Armed Forces has around the world is more than the budget for the State Department.
Well, in fact, I didn't even get to that slide because I was told to finish up. But these are the resources. In 2011, the State Department and all international programs had a budget of $53 billion. This was more than any other time in history.
That includes AID?
53, yes. This includes foreign aid, and foreign aid was $35 billion. What do you think? Too much? Not enough?
Well, my question was about eliminating everything except the military bands and the budget.
Well,
the bands is more.
Right. Well, that Bob Gates was talking about how the bands and all that, but that wasn't that scientific. But here's the comparison. How much do you think the military budget is bigger than the foreign service budget? Ballpark. How much bigger is the military budget?
More than the state.
Right. How much more do you think it is? 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, twice?
Certainly 20, I would think.
So it was actually $640 billion, so about 12 times. And in terms of human resources, there are 13,000 members of the Foreign Service, 8,000 what they call Foreign Service officers, or these are the diplomats, Foreign Service officers, and then 5,000 what they call Foreign Service specialists. These are the secretaries, the IT people, the doctors in the Foreign Service, the security people, in that number. In the armed forces, there are 1.4 million active duty members. This number does not include reservists or civil service personnel in the Pentagon. This is just the active duty members of the. So these are the numbers. I mean, whether you think, the IMF says that there are over 100 countries in the world whose GDP is less than this. So clearly 53 is still a lot of money, and one of the reasons I wanted to learn more about this and to educate the Americans was, I feel like as a taxpayer I should know what my money is being spent on, right? And how that makes sense for American foreign policy and the national interest. So yeah, 53 billion, not 12 times less than the military budget, but still a lot of money. Yeah, could you pass the mic up behind?
Mark, a short comment, and then you'll get the mic.
Yeah, just very quick.
The mic is
to your comment, and about the political appointees, I think you're a little too cynical, Robert.
Oh,
because
me cynical?
Because there are political appointees that are not worth anything, and they're in Luxembourg and whatnot. But you do need political appointees to get things done in the Foreign Service. And your example of Japan is exactly right. The Japanese wanted somebody who had the ear of the president.
Oh yes.
And so they knew if they had an issue, that person could pick up the phone, call the White House, get through all the bureaucracy in Washington, and get their point of view heard. Yeah. And it was the job of the DCM and the diplomatic people in the embassy to inform the ambassador as to what the positions of the Japanese government are and what the U.S. national interests are, so that he could go and advocate for U.S. national interests in Japan. And so I think there's a really healthy relationship between political appointees and career diplomats in most embassies.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And to your point about writing, when I went in, you had lawyers, doctors, PhDs, highly educated people. They spent 3 months, the first 3 months of training, teaching you how to write.
Oh.
Because everything you learned was wrong. And that's why those cables are well written. And I also want to thank you for writing the book, because I think the Foreign Service is a great profession. highly underappreciated, and we need half dozen more books like this.
Actually, many people told me that the cable writing course at FSI wasn't even close to what real life was like. So because that's the thing about, someone asked earlier about whether I met the diplomat who was prepared to do what, right? So you come into the US Foreign Service, you have this introductory, they call it orientation, it's called A100, but it's 5 weeks, that's it. And most of it is bureaucracy. How do you fill a form to get paid, or to take a leave, to move your stuff around? It's not how to be a diplomat. And then you can, you take language. If your first position it requires language, you do that. You take the consular course, because most likely you're going to do consular work, because it's mandatory, right, to do consular work when you come into the Foreign Service. But you do take a cable writing class. But I have people in the book who say, well, I took the course and I went to my first post. It turns out I didn't know how to write cables. Now, was it because the boss there had requirements that weren't, I was lucky enough to attend several classes at FSI last winter, and one of the things that I found, since we are in an academic setting, I would see as one problem the fact that some of the classes are actually pretty good. In fact, some classes are famous across the federal government. They have people from other agencies going to the Foreign Service Institute to take them. The problem is this big picture thing. And one of the things you'll see in the book, people say the Foreign Service doesn't encourage strategic thinking. Actually, Yuri Kim, who you saw at the beginning, she said strategic thinking is beaten out of you in the Foreign Service. Because the mantra now is they're more operational. As an American diplomat, you need to, you're someone who needs to get things done. You need to make things happen rather than just think the big thoughts. And so at FSI, even though you have some classes that are pretty good, I think the big picture, the strategic picture is still missing. How do they fit into that big picture? And then the second is that I felt some of the people that teach there, they're not active duty, they're either outside lecturers or retired. They teach stuff that they haven't practiced in 25 years. There was someone who was teaching negotiations. The last time she did negotiations was in the 80s with the Soviets, okay? Yeah.
Let me, you be next, to follow, because we have this question about political appointees. What are the politics of the FSOs? In other words, my experience has been that they're more likely to be liberal Democrats than right-wing Republicans. So there'll be an election very soon, assuming the typhoon doesn't delay it. Probably Obama-Romney will be more or less 50-50. I mean, it's not going to be 30-70, it's going to be somewhere in that range. If you had the FSOs vote, what do you think the percentage would be?
Well, first of all, scientifically, it's impossible to tell. Nobody's done it.
Yeah.
Nobody's taken polls. Nobody's made people register, or in a way that the number you'll hear is that 80% are Democrats. That's the number, but it's anecdotal. It's based on nothing. It's just out of thin air, really. There are some Republicans, but when I first started doing this, I worked for the Washington Times, which is on the editorial page, a conservative newspaper, which doesn't mean that I'm conservative, but I would go to embassies. I think it was in Pretoria, in South Africa, and this guy comes to me and says, "I'm a Republican."
Was this before Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
I don't think it had nothing to do with it.
Well, it seems like it's almost.
But it was in 2003, so it was due to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But yeah, that's, one thing that I found Foreign Service officers very good at is being able to put their personal feelings aside and just work for whoever the president is. And as much as many of them didn't like Bush, or particularly the first term of the Bush administration, they stuck it out and they did it. They, obviously there were accusations that they weren't doing it to their full, to the full capacity of what they could have done. That Powell and the State Department was sidelined because they didn't want to do the Iraq War and all that. But if you look at what if the White House wants something, it'll happen. It's difficult, as I said, it's difficult to freelance in the Foreign Service.
Yeah, coming back to U.S. national interest and the three elements you have shown, what if there are conflicts among these three elements? Do they have some method or discipline or principle? Maybe top guy will decide to make a final decision, but do they have something to be shared at the working level?
Well, the connectivity, it's been difficult to find this linkage between everything the State Department of American diplomacy do back to the national interest. Particularly before 9/11, it was really difficult because Madeleine Albright says in the book, you can't have humanitarian interests that rise to the level of the national interest. Republicans were saying back then, no, that's nonsense. National security is a national interest, it's not humanitarian. We may have helped Kosovo and bombed Kosovo during the Clinton administration for humanitarian reasons, but that wasn't directly related to the national interest. Now it's much easier because it seems you can always make the case that anything in any country affects the US national interest. Because you want the whole world to be stable, you want the whole world to be as prosperous as possible. So it's not that difficult now. Now that said, I said earlier that the Foreign Service wasn't good at being specific. So that also applies when they go to ask for money. When they go to Capitol Hill, a few months ago, there was a program called Middle East Partnership Initiative, and there was a certain category in there that they needed more money for. And they went to Capitol Hill to ask for more money, and the result was that both Republicans and Democrats say, not only we're not going to give you more money, we're going to cut the whole thing. Because the people you sent up on the Hill could not explain to us how exactly the money was going to be used for. Yeah, and so you still, even though it's easier now to link everything to the national interest, when it comes to money, and you do the Middle East Partnership Initiative, it's still there as a program. It was just this little part of it that wasn't that little because it was over $1 million, but that is no longer. But it just wasn't clear to members of Congress the contribution, the specific contribution that program would have made to US efforts, or even to existing US efforts, that would have basically justified the more funds. So that's a very important question when it comes to funding, because if they want more than this, they'll have to justify it.
I'm still trying to understand the big difference between what the diplomats do now and what they did right after World War II with the Marshall Plan. This almost sounds, the way you're describing it, like these are sort of smaller scale Marshall Plans just going across a lot more territory.
Well, the difference was that with the Marshall Plan, you didn't have as many diplomats there with, wearing boots, actually doing things, meaning training other countries how to govern themselves, running programs for them. They basically gave them the money. There was expertise, there was advice, there's no question about that. But the difference now is that, pick any African country, there are two ways that they're doing this good governance thing. They either teach it, they may run training, seminars. The other way they do it is if you don't teach it, then you just do it, right? What I mean is that, for example, there is an example in the book, someone who used to be the econ chief here, Mark Wall, he used to be ambassador to Chad. And so when he got there, it turned out the Chad government didn't have a counterterrorism program. And they were right next door to Darfur. So the embassy decided just to create one for them, not to teach them how to do it, but just to create one for them. Then they had to train them so they could maintain it. But that kind of thing didn't happen back with the Marshall Plan. Western Europe is not Africa, so this was civilized world there. And even though it was after the war, it was still Western Europe. This whole nation building after the end of the Cold War, Central Eastern Europe. But again, this was more giving them aid and giving them advice, but not exactly running this type of programs for them to in effect bring about good governance, because many of the countries in Europe, and even in Central and Eastern Europe, had some traditions in that before the communist regimes took over. But these are countries that never really knew how to govern themselves, and so that's the difference. They were either colonies, either in, as in much of Africa, or they were under dictatorships for decades, and so self-governance wasn't. It's really holding hands, basically. And I don't think they ever held hands with the Marshall Plan. Is it a little clearer? Yeah. Thanks. It's a very good question, and it's it's good for me to say it out loud and make it out in my own head. So.
Just another guy, sorry,
Sure.
commenting on that. I mean, my experience is that the portfolio of the diplomats, and if you look at U.S. diplomacy up to World War II, it was basically political, military, Europe-centered, and stability of the rest of the world. And after World War II, you've got all of that plus environment, human rights, trafficking, energy, nuclear power, democratization, good governance. So the whole scope of what is defined as diplomacy and national interest has expanded exponentially. Yeah. And that's why you see that long list of skills that diplomats currently need that they didn't need 40, 60 years ago. No one cared about human rights. Environment wasn't even an issue. And Jimmy Carter made human rights a U.S. national interest. He put it in U.S. diplomacy, and it didn't exist until that day.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. What is your impression of American diplomats as human beings, and what are their reputation of American? What are their reputation from their counterparts? I'm asking you this question because when I did my research on Japanese diplomacy from the perspective of other countries, they actually cared about how the diplomats behave in front of them, and there was a criticism because there wasn't deep human engagement from the Japanese side. So I guess there has to be interpersonal elements in there, and I guess that's because the Japanese foreign ministry is made up of diplomats and bureaucrats who come from different planets, pretty much. So I mean, and also if you can also touch upon the composition of the kind of people there, that'll be nice. And another question is, do you have that book on Kindle version?
No, you have to buy it tonight. Yes, it should be. I haven't looked at Amazon Japan, but it should be there.
Okay, thank you. All right. Do you have the credit card?
Sorry?
Do you accept credit card? Again, the door.
And I thought I did, because I have this spanking new. There's a company in the US called Square, which is in Silicon Valley. It's a little square that basically you can swipe credit card. And I have it on my iPad, and I've been using it in the US, but I just realized in Singapore the other day that you have to be in the US because of the IP address. It knows that you're outside the US. And so, unfortunately, that was my disappointment, but I hadn't done my research. So yeah, well, if you want a signed copy, this is the only place to get it. But anyway, the thing is that with this many people, in any organization, you're going to have people who are more human than others, who are more competent than others, and there is, but you're right. Often the Foreign Service is accused of sort of being detached or not in not in the know of what's happening in a country because they sit behind the embassy walls and don't go around much and all that. There's a trend now, and Hillary Clinton has encouraged that to go beyond government. So now she wants diplomacy to be not only government to government but also people to people, and which is difficult with the security situation. And if you're behind embassy walls and barbed wire in some countries, how do you do diplomacy if you can't, are not able to go out and meet with real people? So, but the argument there is, even in countries that are not democracies, public opinion makes a difference. And so they've decided now that they need direct access to the publics, to just private citizens in foreign countries, sometimes over the heads of the government. And so that's why the social media pushes all about, and the State Department is spending a lot of money on that, on social media. And it's part of the humanizing trend in the Foreign Service. They want American diplomacy to open up to not only government but to real people, which is, that's new. I mean, other countries still practice traditional diplomacy for the most part, and it's government to government. Not the public diplomacy that doesn't exist outside the US Foreign Service, of course it does. But they're saying it's not only about public diplomacy. All parts of diplomacy should be, in some cases, we should go directly to the people rather than just keep doing. And you said the ambassador should be the link between the American government and the Japanese government. Yes, but that's why he does all the public events that he does, because it's not only about governments, but it's also about the people. And that, I could argue that to achieve that, you need to be more human, right?
So, I mean, I'm sure they're nice people.
But again,
What way are they nice, or they're just nice people everywhere?
Well, okay. Here's the thing. There are many extremely talented people in the U.S. Foreign Service, and I also know people who I don't think should be in the Foreign Service. I don't even know how they got in the first place. Okay, but it's 13,000 people. Of course there will be such, whether it's the US Foreign Service or any company, a multinational company. So the question is, how do you make sure that you have, as I said earlier, the right people in the right place at the right time? And you do this by training, not because the entrance process, gets these wide pool of people in the Foreign Service, and whether you'll see the current Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, is a Foreign Service officer. It's very rare that an FSO is the Deputy Secretary of State. And you'll see in the book people say he's a good diplomat, he's an excellent diplomat, but it's not because of anything that the institution did. It was because of whatever was in his DNA when he came. So this is the criticism from the inside that I found, was that the institution doesn't do enough to produce good diplomats. It's typically either you came with it or you were very lucky to have great bosses along the way that made you what you are. But there are good bosses, but there are bad bosses too. And if you happen to have some of those, then you're in trouble. So it's very, it's just so relative. It's so subjective, and to judge 13,000 people, it's not easy. So that's why I wanted to humanize it and give you. The book has the good and the bad. Maybe I focused too much on the good tonight, but but the last part of the book, the last fourth of the book, is called "Looking in the Mirror," and so it's critique, but it's critique that comes from inside, because I didn't have an agenda. I mean, I tried to tell the story and explain and make sense of things, but I didn't want to glamorize the Foreign Service or denigrate it or criticize it or judge it too much. I mean, you have to do some judging if you write a book. But that really wasn't. I didn't have. I'll never be in the Foreign Service, and I have no relatives who will be in the Foreign Service. So now I have no bone to pick or any personal agenda.
Yoshikawa-san, you have the last question, short question.
Yuki Yoshikawa of the Okinawa government. Quick, shortly, if you have a chance to compare the American Foreign Service with other counterparts, what do you describe the strengths and the weakness of the American?
Well, the biggest difference is this new part, which is the good governance part, or transformational, whatever you call it. Hillary Clinton has not called it transformational. She has her own catchphrases. But obviously, no other country thinks it can change the world, right? Or has the resources to change the world. Look at the Australians and Canadians. They've been cutting back on resources for diplomacy. They've been, eliminating positions. But the other difference is, many countries in the world give foreign aid. Scandinavians give foreign aid. Even the Swiss give foreign aid. But it's not as much, first of all. But what's more important is development now is part of diplomacy in the US. Clinton has specifically said that development is part and parcel of diplomacy. Even in some countries where the USAID is not present, because it's not in every country, much of those duties are being performed by State Department people, but people in the Foreign Service people in those embassies. The USAID is part of the Foreign Service, obviously, and it has been for a long time, but used to be this view that development is separate from diplomacy. And that's how most countries still view it. Because they don't necessarily connect the money they give or the foreign aid they give to political agendas or political considerations. Condoleezza Rice changed that in the US and said, how are we determining how much we give to each country? It turns out it was based on need or whatever other criteria. She said, no, it has to be done based on political reasons, I mean, foreign policy reasons. You give aid to a country not because there is need, there's always need everywhere. You give it because you want that country to get to a place where it doesn't need foreign aid anymore, right? So it's an investment to produce good governance and whatever else you care about, rather than just funneling money because there's need and because you need to help people not be poor, which, you know, how long do you need to do that? But that's the difference. I think in other countries that link is still not as clear as at least the Americans are trying to make it.
Well, thank you very much. We've reached